Wow.
Imagine this. It's dark, the rain is pouring down all around you. You feel cold and a little bit scared. You've just been saved from death by a super strong, psychopathic blonde, and as you stare up at him in what should be an impactful, emotional moment, Harrison Ford's monotonous voice comes on and he says,
I don't know why he saved my life. Maybe in those last moments he loved life more than he ever had before. Not just his life, anybody's life, my life.
No. The debate on voiceovers and narration in film is a passionate one. Many claim it to be sloppy, uninspired screenwriting. You're supposed to show, not tell.
Wait a minute. This isn't my world. Disappointed!
Narration and its long-standing history as an art form is an interesting and complex topic that I think will be worth exploring over a series of videos. And what better way to begin than by going back in time to early film history Japan, where we will more closely examine some of cinema's early technological shifts, the popularity of mixed media, whatever that is, and the art of narration. Because as today's topic will show us, it can definitely be an art form. I know it doesn't seem like it when Harrison Ford performs it, but it can be an art form. In this film history lesson, we will take a look at a group of professional film narrators called Benshi, how they brought a sense of humanness to the film screen, and what eventually led to their professional demise. And to us all really hating on voiceovers? I don't know about that one. Hopefully by the end of this video, you will all be inspired to host your own narrated movie nights and once again invite that friend you stopped inviting because she keeps making comments while you're all just trying to watch the movie back into your lives again. I am that friend. Please invite me. In this video series about film history, I will cover interesting topics in greater detail to give you a broad knowledge of our beloved cinema and its past. If you're interested in film history and would like to be updated when new film history lessons come out, please consider subscribing to this channel. It will really help me out. I like it a lot. I do a little dance every time I get a subscriber. It's a good time. The Benshi were Japanese performers who presented live narration for silent films. The word Benshi stems from the longer phrase Katsudo Shashin Benshi, which directly translates into English as motion picture speaker. In the early days of film, the Benshi started off the movie screening with a Mai Setsume, an introduction before the movie, an explanation of what would be happening in the film. As films evolved, the Benshi would stand in a dimly visible spot to the left of the movie screen, often wearing Western clothes such as a tuxedo and a bow tie, and perform their setsume as the movie was happening. They would read the intertitles and voice out all the on-screen characters. Sometimes they would do it alone, or for certain Japanese titles, several Benshi would come together to voice the different actors on screen. But they didn't stop there. They would also add their own commentary, explain the plot and visuals, or describe the reason behind sudden transitions or otherwise confusing edits. Some recited poetry or literature to amplify moving moments. And because they often only got one single screening of the film before it was time for the first public viewing, they were known for improvising, making jokes, and going off script. This meant that they would manipulate the films as they saw fit. If the Benshi's dialogue would take longer to perform than what a scene allowed for, the Benshi would just instruct the projectionist to sort of lower the projection speed. Equally, if he found a scene boring, he might just crack some jokes and get on with it. One can find examples of similar narration practices in other places around this time, but Japan is the only place where the narrators became an integral part of the cinema industry. They also gained some popularities in countries like Taiwan, Thailand, and Korea, but this was mainly due to Japan's influence over these countries at this time. The Benshi Golden Age lasted between 1926 to 1931 and became an art form in itself. The Benshi were often what drew people into theaters. They became stars in their own right, often even more popular than the actors and actresses themselves. Think of them like Brad Pitt, Elizabeth Taylor, or Dwayne Johnson of silent film era Japan. Although they were something different than an actor, they could be more accurately described as storytellers. They gained a similar kind of stardom as actors and actresses of today. They would often be featured in magazines and newspapers, and promotional posters would include a photo of the Benshi as they were announcing the film. Even as production companies had the option to exchange the Benshi for intertitles to cut costs, like it cost a lot of money to hire the Benshi and pay their salaries, even if they did have the option to cut them out, they didn't. They would much rather pay the salary of the Benshi, even though that would mean higher expenses for them, as the Benshi and their ability to successfully tell a story was largely credited to a lot of a film's success. It's what could make or break a certain theater's popularity. Wow, that's really great. The Benshi, I know what you're thinking. What happened? Where did they go? I have never met a single Benshi in my life. And I hear you, buddy. Me neither. I've never met them. Let's figure out what happened to the Benshi profession right now. Except no, because before we move on to the reasons behind the Benshi's professional demise, I'd first like to discuss why I find the Benshi such a fascinating part of film history. Through their narration, they added a human element to the film screen. Due to the Benshi narration, no film experience was like the other. Film, which was otherwise or which is pre-recorded, became a live event. Not only did you have the performance of the actors and the actresses on screen, but another layer was added by the Benshi's performance. The film here wasn't the main event, or I guess it was, but it was part of a discussion. Benshi, in their quest to draw moviegoers to their specific theater, would frequently mix in other types of media to enrich the experience, whether it be jokes, ad-libs, improv, poetry, reference to literature or plays, or a rich kabuki orchestra, which I guess they usually tended to have instead of piano. The early Japanese film experience was a mishmash of different influences, turning every film into a show. For all the nerds out there, it's like those moments in a really good Dungeons and Dragons campaign. You have your eerie dungeon music in the background, your DM is doing monster noises while one of your fellow co-players, who is a bard naturally, recites this book of poetry that he has. Sure, we cannot fully know if that is what going to a really good Benshi performance was really like, but I'd like to think it is. Brad Pitt doing a Dungeons and Dragons campaign moment in front of kabuki-inspired images. Get it, Brad, get it! Nowadays, movies have big budgets and technology has allowed filmmakers to include everything that's within their vision into their actual films. The music, editing, colors, and sets can all be presented to us the way the filmmaker intended. But in early films, a lot of today's technology didn't exist. Thus, the Benshi had to fill in the blanks, turning the film viewing into a much more collaborative experience. And although I love cinema for what it is today, I'm fascinated by this early time. Film has always incorporated the artistic traditions of the past in new and fresh ways, and early on, there were no worldwide standards for how to view film, making it possible for such a thing as film narration to be a solid profession. A huge part of me really craves new ways of experiencing film, and looking back at something like the Benshi is teaching me new ways of doing so. Now we're here. Now it's time for us to more closely examine what enabled the Benshi's existence and what ultimately came to be the reason for their fall into oblivion. Throughout the history of cinema, we've encountered many technological shifts. The invention of projectors, sound, color, widescreen, 3D technology, CGI, the list could be made very long here. With all these shifts, the industry has faced challenges and found new technological wonders that have developed the art of filmmaking. It comes as no surprise that the Benshi profession was born out of one of these technological shifts, namely the birth of cinema. Cinema in its early stages was not very developed. Worldwide standards for how film should be made did not exist, and so the early film industries were influenced by the art forms that came before them. Whilst the Western film industries dealt with the problem of not being able to record sound through something called intertitles, which is those title cards describing the action or dialogue that you sometimes see pop up in old silent movies, the Japanese film industry used influences from earlier artistic traditions such as kabuki theater. In fact, most of the early Japanese films were simply kabuki plays that had been adapted to film. Kabuki had a long tradition of narration, and as such, it felt natural for audiences that this newly emerged film medium should have narrators as well. And so due to this technological shift, a new profession was born. The Benshi were a result of new technology, but still embodied an old familiar narrative tradition that audiences embraced and felt at home with. As such, we can only assume that for Japanese film audiences, the bridge between the old forms of entertainment that they knew, like kabuki, and this newly emerging film medium was made an easier one to cross. But we all know it. Technological change is scary and bad, and the robots will eventually take over and the AI will eat us alive, etc., etc. So naturally, the death of the Benshi profession can also be attributed to a technological shift, of course. The early Japanese film industry did its best to battle the oncoming of sound to cinema, largely due to the Benshi and their popularity. Filmmakers were used to making films a certain way. They edited films with the Benshi in mind. It should be noted that I'm talking about Japanese filmmakers here. Shots would be extended to allow room for explanations, and it was no big deal to leave out some important details. The Benshi were there after all and could save the day and fill in the blanks. Transitioning to sound would also mean high costs for both theaters and production companies, both of which the Benshi were highly benefiting with their profession. Japan was therefore one of the last big film industries to take the leap from silent into sound and kept their cinema silent well into the 1930s. The Benshi did their best to hold out and stay strong, but eventually the new had to replace the old, and slowly but surely the Benshi profession died out. Because, as we all know, all good things must end eventually. I know we don't like it, but it happens. And unfortunately for us, so did the Benshi profession. In my research on this topic, I found that there were 3 major factors that contributed to the Benshi's demise. There might be more out there. I haven't studied it for an extended amount of time, but I did read a whole bunch of stuff. So let's just say that there were three major factors that contributed to their demise. First off, we have what I like to call the Benshi versus the government. We don't really have to call it that, I just like to be a bit dramatic. It's well known that the Benshi became popular. They became stars in their own right, I've said this before, and some of them tapped into nonconformist aspects of the Japanese culture. They often came under criticism by Japanese newspapers and government officials for spicing up their setsume with some foul language, for performing drunk, for cheating others out of money, I don't know how they did that, and for having scandalous affairs with married women. And although this may sound like something many popular stars have done throughout the years, like it is occurring in our star system or throughout our star system that people have been drunk or acted immoral, it is clear that the Japanese government at this time began worrying about how this would affect public morals. I mean, we wouldn't want the general public to suddenly think it was okay to be drunk or to have affairs with married women. It could cause all sorts of havoc. Police would often sit in on viewings just because of this, to make sure that the Benshi wouldn't change the storyline of a movie into something unsuitable to the eyes of the public. This suggests that the government was well aware of the Benshi's influence at this time on both what kind of entertainment the public enjoyed, but also their morals. The Benshi were so well received that the government eventually decided it was time to step in. They needed to get in on this ship, or on this ship? I don't know how the expression goes. In 1917, the Tokyo Police Department began enforcing a licensing system as a way to control the Benshi performance. This meant that in order to practice the art of setsume in a movie theater, you had to pass an examination where you were graded on certain things, like your knowledge on the social status of film, as well as your general cultural knowledge. Kind of like a taxi license, but for Benshi performance, so to speak. One can only assume that with this, the government did their best to train the Benshi in what they should and should not talk about on stage. And although many Benshi did not always care about what the government deemed acceptable for their performances, over time, the pressure from outside sources like the government began affecting their popularity. Secondly, early film industries had an exhibition-based structure. Here we have this new technology technological marvel, and the focus was to exhibit this technology to new audiences. The Benshi were essential when explaining the cinema phenomenon to new and regular cinema goers alike. But as the film medium developed, the focus of the industry slowly went from exhibition to production. Filmmakers started discussing cinema as an art form. They asked philosophical, technical, and artistic questions about what film was, how it should be used, and how it differed from other art forms. At the same time, the photographic-based star system appeared, and actors and actresses began to garner worldwide recognition. And although Benshi were largely popular, they did represent this former focus on exhibition in a time when people began to care more about film as production. And thirdly, we've already mentioned it before, new technology came with the introduction of sound to cinema. Aspiring young filmmakers didn't want to just film old kabuki plays anymore, and still talking about the Japanese filmmakers. They wanted to create art, and they wanted to create art in new ways. It is fairly understandable that the younger filmmaking generations wanted to evolve the art form, as the rest of the world had already done. Western movies suddenly had sound. The result was a bunch of movies that people wanted to see. And so talkies were eventually to become a thing in Japan as well. If you look at statistics from an annual report published by the Asahi newspaper company from the year 1930, but it was a presentation of 1929 to 1930, we can see that Japan had a total of 1,338 cinemas and 6,038 professional benshi. When the technology of sound became widespread, they sadly ended up losing their jobs. Hopefully they went on to do other fun, fulfilling things with their lives. I don't know, but we can hope that. And for those of you who have made it this far and now feel sad that you won't ever get to experience the benshi anymore, don't fret. There are still a few troopers out there in Japan, like for example Sawato Midori, Sakamoto Raiko, and Kataoka Ichiro. There are also groups in the United States that are trying to revive the art form, playing with new ways of presenting films while taking on titles such as neo-benshi and movie tellers. So if you're really interested, you might still be able to experience film as it's told through the eyes of someone else. Or you could just host your own narrated movie night. Oh boy, have I been waiting for you to ask that question. I'm very passionate about this topic, so naturally I've already made a video explaining in great detail why I think hosting your own narrated movie nights is a fantastic idea. Not only will you be reviving what we have now come to learn is a long-lost art form and an incredible narrative tradition, but you'll also be having a lot of fun. How can I learn more about this narrated movie night thing, you say? I've left a link to the video in the description box below, and I'll include it in a card above, so click it. Well fellas, that was all we could cover in today's film history lesson. Are you as into film history as I am? Is there a specific topic that you would like for me to cover in an upcoming installment on this channel? Don't forget, you know where to put it. Leave it in the comments and we can talk about it. If you like the content that I make, I would really appreciate it if you'd subscribe to this channel. I try my best to post weekly. It might not always make it, but I try really hard. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram if that's something that you'd be interested in. I post my daily film and TV musings and sort of updates on how it's going here. And I definitely need more friends on there for sure. Thank you so much for watching this video. Bye!